Welcome to another presentation brought to you by Understanding Minds, a clinic specialising in the learning, developmental and behavioural disorders. And by Understanding Words, an evidence-based reading intervention for children with reading difficulties and those at risk of reading difficulties. Hi, I'm Craig Wright. This presentation reports on a pilot study of the Understanding Words reading intervention program. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues Michaeli Wright from Understanding Minds and Liz Conlon and Murray Dick from the Griffith University Health Institute who've been involved in this and other research on Understanding Words. Let's start with the problem that I was trying to solve in writing Understanding Words. We know that a significant portion of the student population have difficulties with reading. These difficulties predispose them to adverse behavioural, mental health and economic outcomes. There's considerable evidence on how we can best improve reading skills in children who have reading difficulties, but it's unclear how much that evidence is actually permeating clinical practice in schools. A recent study by myself and Liz Conlon, which is currently in press, suggests that learning support services aren't particularly effective for students with reading difficulties. We tracked the reading growth of 61 students over the course of a whole school year. Those students were involved in at least bi-weekly or 2 times a week learning support sessions with the intent of improving their reading skills. Just 7 out of 61 students made clinically significant response. The rest of the kids either didn't improve their reading skills at all, or in some cases even went backwards. Why are school services sometimes ineffective? I think it's important to say, first of all, it's not due to lack of will. Every teacher I've met wants to help their children improve in most areas of the curriculum. And in most cases, it's not due to lack of teacher skill. I think there is a problem with using non-specific programs, and programs is there in inverted commas for a reason, because a considerable amount of learning support that I've observed involves some fairly non-specific, some might actually call them vague activities that have no clearly defined purpose. The other problem, of course, is that learning support settings often have to make use of paraprofessionals because the learning support services aren't particularly well funded. So we're not talking about the highest skilled teachers in the school. We're often talking about people who are basically parents who have been co-opted into helping children with the highest level of need within the school. Finally, learning support services or interventions for reading difficulties are usually fairly costly and take a lot of time. And as I've already mentioned, learning support services are not well funded. So typically there'll be an initial burst of enthusiasm, maybe at the start of the year or when some funding is gathered from somewhere, but that will taper off over time. So the solution that we came up with was to write Understanding Words. Now we knew it needed to be based on evidence, so it needed to be based on the science of reading. It needed to include all of the essential elements of reading instruction that have been identified by research. It needed to be very explicit, so we couldn't leave anything to chance. We needed to teach the kids everything they needed to know, and it had to be sequenced. So it had to go in a clearly defined teaching sequence with an emphasis on developing mastery before the students were allowed to move on. Most importantly, and this is where the gap in the teaching market was, if you like, was that it needed to be cost effective. So there are a number of other programs around that can be run one-on-one, but due to the funding constraints of our current school system, those programs rarely get used. So the program needed to be cost effective. It needed to be able to be run by paraprofessionals and or by parents, and it definitely needed to be a small group program. And finally, and this was more with an eye to the future, it needed to be evidence-based. In this initial study, we took 25 students, 18 of whom were male. The age ranged from 7 to 9 years and 9 months. Quite a complex group, so 11 had ADHD, 7 were on medication, 1 had Asperger's syndrome, and 2 were diagnosed with specific language impairment. We measured intellectual ability, listening comprehension, vocabulary, word identification, non-word reading or phonological decoding skills, reading comprehension, and phonological awareness. Treatment protocol used the first edition of Understanding Words. The kids received one-to-one tuition for an hour over 40 sessions, and this consisted of 2 sessions per week for a 20-week period. The results include statistically significant gains and large effect sizes on word identification skills, phonological decoding, so their ability to decode and identify unfamiliar words, and on reading comprehension. One of the things that we concluded was most important was that we achieved gains of 0.23 to 0.39 of a standard score point per hour of intervention. So in other words, for every hour of intervention, they got better by 0.23 to 0.39 of a standard score point. And these gains were equivalent to gains reported in other published studies. So basically what we're saying is the effectiveness of the program was equivalent to other programs that are considered to be evidence-based. At post-testing, so at the conclusion of the intervention, 84% of the group had scores within the normal range for phonological decoding. So in other words, their ability to decode unfamiliar words was completely normal by the end of the study. 52% had normal post-treatment scores in reading comprehension. So again, that means they've basically returned to the average range at the conclusion of the intervention. We have a look here at this graph. It shows pre and post-treatment scores for word identification, phonological decoding, and reading comprehension. The red bars represent the pre-treatment scores, so for word identification here, the blue bars represent the post-treatment score. See, we can see here that the group as a whole have moved up significantly in their word identification scores. So they've gone from a standard score of 80 through to a standard score on average of 90. In phonological decoding, pre-treatment, all of the students were, on average, the students were had a standard score of 81 to 82. At post-treatment, as a group, their average was 99. So, by the way, the average score within the population for these tests is 100. So that represents the average range. And you can see the group as a whole were pretty close to the average range. Similarly, for reading comprehension, all began the study very low. So approximately 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, so very poor reading comprehension. These are kids who would be struggling to extract enough meaning from text in the classroom to get by. At post-treatment, we had a significant increase to the point where, as I said, 52% of the sample returned to within normal limits, which is a really clinically meaningful response in response to a fairly small amount of treatment. So our conclusions were that Understanding Words produced significant change in important reading skills in 25 mostly complex cases with relatively little treatment. So we're only talking 40 hours of intervention, which isn't really much. And as I've said earlier, that produced clinically meaningful response in reading comprehension in half of the sample. So, and that was the most important thing, was that the number of students whose reading skills were within normal limits at the conclusion of treatment was really quite high. Finally, the program as it stood in this study seemed effective, but it wasn't yet cost effective. So we had to conduct other studies that looked at whether the program could be run in small groups and particularly by paraprofessionals in schools.